Welcome to Shadows of the 70s. Tonight, we are going into a decade that felt modern on the surface, but still held vast. Dark pockets where a person could disappear without leaving a single trace of their true name. This episode features 10 stories of cold cases, mountain disasters, and secrets that the Earth is only just beginning to give back. The audio tonight is paired with the steady, rhythmic drumming of a heavy rainstorm to help you settle in. If these stories stay with you, please consider subscribing or leaving a comment to let me know where you are listening from tonight. Before we head into the frozen heights of Norway, do me a quick favor and tap that like button as gently as you would check the lock on your front door after hearing a floorboard creak in the empty hallway. It helps the channel stay alive, and it might just keep the shadows at bay for another hour. Stay careful out there. Now, our first story begins with a woman who moved like a ghost through the high-end hotels of Europe. She traveled the world with 8 different identities and a suitcase full of wigs, but she could not outrun what was waiting for her in the Ice Valley. In 1970, the city of Bergen was a place of gray stone, cold salt water, and low-hanging clouds that seemed to snag on the surrounding mountain peaks. It was a town that lived by the rhythm of the docks and the coming and going of travelers who used the railway to cross the rugged spine of Norway. Among these travelers was a woman who stood out not because she was loud, but because she was so perfectly, meticulously composed. She appeared to be in her late 30s, with an elegant posture and an expensive taste in silk scarves that suggested a life of quiet wealth and frequent, purposeful movement. She arrived at the Hotel Hordeheimen with the kind of understated grace that made the staff stand up a little straighter. She spoke in a soft, melodic voice, shifting between French, German, and English with a fluency that made it impossible to pin down where she had actually come from. To the desk clerk, she was simply Genevieve Lancière from Louvain. She signed the register with a firm, practiced hand and requested a room that offered both privacy and a clear view of the street below. There was a distance in her eyes, a sort of professional coolness that discouraged small talk. Her daily routine was a study in controlled isolation. Every morning, she would descend to the dining room at the exact same time, sitting at a corner table where her back was protected by the wall. She would order a simple breakfast and a pot of tea, which she drank while staring toward the window, her fingers occasionally tracing the rim of the porcelain cup. She did not read the newspaper or engage with other guests. Instead, she seemed to be waiting, her entire body tuned to the sound of the lobby door opening or the distant, muffled chime of the telephone at the front desk. When she walked through the streets of Bergen, she wore heavy coats and large dark sunglasses that obscured most of her face. She was often seen carrying a small, black handbag clutched tightly against her side, her pace brisk and deliberate. Those who passed her noted the faint, sophisticated scent of her perfume, something floral but sharp, like jasmine caught in a cold wind. She moved like someone who knew exactly where the exits were in every building she entered. A woman who had spent years mastering the art of being seen without ever truly being known by anyone at all. Inside her hotel room, the atmosphere was even more sterilized. She did not leave books on the nightstand or personal photographs on the dresser. When the maids came in to turn down the bed, they found the space unnaturally tidy, as if no one were living there at all. The only sign of her presence was the subtle arrangement of her suitcases, which were always locked and placed in the exact center of the floor. In 1970, a woman traveling alone through Norway was not unheard of, but it carried a certain social weight that made the staff watch her with a quiet, lingering curiosity. One afternoon, a maid entering room 407 noticed something that felt like a small, sharp distortion in the woman's perfect facade. Lying on the vanity was a pair of silver sewing scissors and a small pile of dark fabric scraps. Upon closer inspection, the maid realized the woman had been methodically cutting the labels out of every single garment she owned. The brand names, the washing instructions, the country of origin, everything had been surgically removed. It was as if she were actively erasing the history of her own belongings, stripping away every clue that could link her to a specific place or shop. The pressure began to rise during the final week of November. The woman started changing hotels frequently, moving from the Hordeheimen to the Hotel Orion and then to the Rosenkrantz, never staying in one place for more than a few nights. Her behavior grew increasingly guarded. She was seen in a local cafe sitting with two men in heavy black coats, their conversation hushed and intense. She did not eat during this meeting. She simply watched the men's hands, her own breath coming in short, shallow rhythms that betrayed a flicker of the terror she was working so hard to hide under her silk scarf. On the morning of November 18th, she checked out of her final hotel for the last time. She settled her bill in cash, using crisp, high-denomination Deutsche Marks, and requested a taxi to the Bergen railway station. The driver noted that she seemed exhausted, her skin appearing pale and translucent in the weak morning light. At the station, she did not board a train. Instead, she walked to the luggage lockers and deposited two large suitcases. Turning the key with a final, decisive click, she walked out into the cold Bergen mist, carrying nothing but her handbag and the secrets she had spent months protecting. 11 days later, a father and his two young daughters were hiking through the scree slopes of Isdalen, a remote area known as the Ice Valley. It is a place where the sun rarely reaches the bottom of the ravine, and the wind howls through the jagged rocks like a living thing. As they navigated a steep, frozen slope, the youngest girl pointed toward a dark shape nestled among the gray stones. It looked like a discarded pile of clothes at first, but as they got closer, the smell hit them a heavy, cloying scent of burnt chemical and scorched earth that seemed to hang motionless in the sub-zero mountain air. They found the woman lying in a small, hollowed-out niche between the rocks. She was partially charred, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had been upright when the flames took her. Arranged around her with haunting precision were several objects: a single rubber boot, a plastic water bottle, and a silver spoon. The hallmarks on the spoon had been meticulously filed away, leaving the metal scarred and anonymous. There was no sign of a struggle, no scuffed dirt or displaced stones. Yet the setting was so desolate and difficult to reach that it felt physically impossible for a woman to have come here alone. The local police arrived as the light was failing, their boots crunching on the frozen ground with a sound like breaking glass. As they processed the scene, they found several dozen phenomol sleeping pills in the woman's stomach, many of them not yet absorbed. It looked like a suicide on paper, but the forensic team couldn't ignore the oddity of the fire. The gasoline had been poured with a steady hand, and the woman had not flinched as the heat rose. In the silence of the valley, the only sound was the low, rhythmic thrum of the wind vibrating against the rescue litters, a frequency that felt like it was pressing directly into the officers' chests. Back at the railway station, the police opened the lockers and found the woman's suitcases. Inside was a collection of expensive wigs, several pairs of non-prescription glasses, and a notebook filled with columns of alphanumeric codes. When the code was eventually broken, it revealed a detailed itinerary of her travels across Europe, marked by the dates she had stayed in various cities. But there was no passport, no driver's license. Every single identifying mark on every object had been removed. She was a woman who had successfully turned herself into a ghost, leaving the world with nothing but a series of cryptic dates and a pile of wigs. Years later, a witness finally came forward, a man who had been hiking in the same valley on the day the woman disappeared. He described seeing a woman in elegant clothes being followed by two men in dark coats. He said she looked terrified, her mouth opening as if to scream, but no sound came out. When he tried to report this to the police in 1970, he was told to forget everything he saw because the case was too big for a local hiker to understand. The weight of that silence sat in the room like a physical force, the sound of a truth being suppressed by the very people meant to find it. The Isdalen ravine is a narrow, lightless space where the rock walls seem to lean inward, trapping the sound of your own breathing until it is all you can hear. The cold here is not just a temperature, it is a weight that pulls at your joints and makes every movement feel like an impossible choice. As the woman looked up at the gray sky for the last time, The sound of the wind was replaced by a sudden, violent whoosh of air as the gasoline ignited. She thought of the Nuremberg streets of her childhood, the warm smell of baking bread, and the simple, heavy realization that after all the aliases and the wigs, she would finally be known by nothing at all. The investigation eventually went cold, buried under the geopolitical tensions of the era. Norway was testing the Penguin missile in the region at the time, and the theory that the woman was a high-level intelligence asset, perhaps a courier or a spotter, became the only logic that fit the facts. She was a professional who had been caught in the machinery of a war that didn't use soldiers, but people who could blend into the background of a hotel lobby. When she became a liability, she was scrubbed from existence with the same surgical precision she had used to cut the labels out of her silk coats. The update in 2026, using advanced DNA and isotope testing on her teeth, confirmed that she spent her early years in the Nuremberg region of Germany. It gave her a point of origin, but it did not give her back her life. She remains buried in the Mellendal Cemetery in Bergen, resting in a zinc coffin that was specifically chosen so that her body would not decompose, in case her family ever came to claim her. But no one has ever come. She lies there under a plain stone. A woman who spoke 4 languages but chose to take her final words into the frozen earth of the Ice Valley. Sometimes, a life is not defined by what a person leaves behind, but by how much effort they put into making sure nothing remains. The Isdal Woman is a reminder that the world can be a very small place for those who are trying to hide, and that eventually, even the most carefully constructed silence will start to echo from the gray, windswept ravines of the Norwegian mountains. That same sense of a life being systematically erased traveled thousands of miles across the globe to a place where the air was thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of tropical exhaust and a different kind of ending. In 1970, the federal highway was the primary artery of Malaysia, a strip of dark asphalt that cut through the dense, heavy green of the tropical landscape to connect Kuala Lumpur with the coast. At night, the road was a river of orange light from the street lamps, flickering against the heat haze that rose from the ground. The air was always thick enough to taste, smelling of damp earth, petrol, and the sweet, rotting scent of fallen fruit from the trees that crowded the shoulder. Perera Sinnappa was a woman who moved through this landscape with a grace that seemed almost out of place. She was 31 years old, a school teacher who had once stood on a stage as a runner-up for Miss Malaysia. Even in her classroom, surrounded by the chalk dust and the humid chatter of her students, she possessed a radiance that people found difficult to look away from. She carried herself with the poise of someone who had been trained to be seen. Yet there was a deep, quiet sadness in the way she held her shoulders. Her life had been divided into a clear before and after. Before, she was the wife of a chemist named Sinnappa, a man who adored her and provided a life of middle-class comfort. After, she was a widow. A year earlier, her husband had died in a violent car accident on that same federal highway. Since that moment, Jean's world had narrowed significantly. She lived in a house in Petaling Jaya, her days defined by the needs of her 3 young children, Damayanti, Deidra, and Dilip, and the demands of her job at the school. Every morning, Jean would wake before the sun to prepare the children's uniforms. She was meticulous about the details. She would press the white shirts until they were crisp, her hands moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. The sound of the iron hiss was often the only noise in the house, while the world outside was still blue and silent. She took pride in these small acts of order. They were the anchors that kept her from drifting away in the wake of her husband's death. She wanted her children to feel that their world was still solid, even if the man who built it was gone. In the classroom, she was known as a teacher who was both firm and deeply kind. She taught her lessons with a soft, melodic voice that commanded attention without ever needing to rise in volume. Her students admired her not just for her beauty, but for the way she looked at them as if she truly saw their potential. She would wear her hair swept back, revealing a face that still held the sharp, clean lines of her beauty queen days. but the sparkle in her eyes had been replaced by a watchful, tired light that only flickered when she was distracted by a memory. The house she lived in was often filled with the presence of her extended family. In Malaysian culture at that time, a widow was rarely left truly alone. The family structure would close ranks around her, providing support that was sometimes as suffocating as it was helpful. Her brother-in-law, a man named Karthigesu, had moved in to help with the children and the household affairs. He was a lecturer, a man of education and standing, and he took his role as the protector of his brother's family with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. Jean's routine was a cycle of duty. She would drive the children to school, head to her own workplace, and then return home to oversee homework and dinner. She rarely went out for herself. Her wardrobe, once filled with the vibrant colors of a woman who enjoyed the spotlight, had been largely replaced by the more somber tones of mourning. Yet, she could not hide the fact that she was a woman in her prime, possessing a magnetic quality that drew the attention of men wherever she went. This attention was a source of constant, low-level pressure in her life. She often spent her evenings sitting on the veranda after the children were asleep. She would watch the moths batter themselves against the porch light, their wings making a dry, frantic sound. In those moments of solitude, she would think of her husband. She missed the way the house felt when he was in it, the weight of his footsteps, the smell of his pipe tobacco. Without him, the rooms felt too large, the shadows in the corners too deep. She was a woman who had been loved completely, and the absence of that love felt like a physical coldness that the tropical heat could not reach. One of the few things she kept for herself was her collection of letters and small mementos. She had always been a person who valued the written word, someone who found comfort in the permanence of ink on paper. She kept these items in a small, locked box in her room. To the outside world, she was the perfect widow, a pillar of strength and decorum. But inside, she was a woman still trying to find her footing in a world that expected her to remain a stationary monument to her husband's memory, never moving forward and never looking away. Her relationship with Karthigesu was one of necessity. He was there to handle the things she could not, or was not expected to, manage alone. He was a constant shadow in the house, his voice a low drone in the background of her daily life. He was helpful, certainly, but there was a weight to his presence that she found increasingly difficult to ignore. He watched her. He watched the way she spoke to neighbors, the way she dressed for work, and the way she retreated into her own thoughts. It was a protection that felt more like a perimeter. The social landscape of 1970s, Malaysia was one where a woman's reputation was her most valuable and fragile currency. For a woman as beautiful and visible as Jean, any deviation from the role of the grieving widow would have been met with immediate and harsh judgment. This was a form of social engineering that ensured she remained within a very narrow path. She understood the legal and cultural stakes perfectly. To be anything other than what was expected was to risk the security of her children's future and her own standing in the community. On the night of April 6th, 1970, the routine was broken. Jean and Karthigesu had decided to go out for dinner, a rare departure from her usual evenings at home. They had gone to a restaurant in the city, a place where the lights were low and the air conditioning hummed a constant, artificial chill. Jean had dressed with care, wearing a simple but elegant outfit that reminded her of the woman she used to be. For a few hours, the pressure of her mourning seemed to lift, replaced by the simple, human pleasure of a meal and a change of scenery. As they began the drive back to Petaling Jaya, the federal highway was relatively quiet. The orange street lamps cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement. Jean sat in the passenger seat of the white Fiat 124, her head resting against the cool glass of the window. The car was a small, enclosed world, the engine making a steady, reassuring vibration that she felt in the base of her spine. She watched the dark shapes of the trees rushing past, their leaves flashing briefly in the headlights of the occasional oncoming car. The silence in the car was not uncomfortable, but it held a certain tension. Karthigesu was a man who often spoke in pronouncements, and tonight he seemed particularly focused on the road ahead. Jean found herself thinking about the next morning, the shirts she would need to iron, the lesson plans she had left on her desk. She wondered if the children were sleeping soundly, and if the youngest had remembered to keep his nightlight on. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of longing for the simple safety of her home, for the moment she could lock the front door and be alone. About halfway through the journey, Carthagesu pulled the car over to the shoulder of the highway. He claimed he needed to relieve himself, a common enough occurrence on a long drive. He stepped out of the Fiat, leaving the engine running and the headlights cutting two bright paths into the darkness ahead. Jean remained in her seat, the interior light of the car casting a soft, yellow glow over her. She watched him walk a short distance away toward the edge of the jungle, his figure quickly becoming a silhouette against the encroaching trees. In that moment, Jean was alone in the car, surrounded by the vast, black hum of the Malaysian night. The sound of the traffic was a distant, rhythmic pulse, a physical pressure that seemed to push against the metal skin of the Fiat. She could hear the chirping of the cicadas, a sound so loud and constant it felt like a ringing in her ears. She adjusted her position, the vinyl of the seat creaking under her weight. She looked at her hands in her lap, her wedding ring catching the light. She thought, "I just want this night to be over." Suddenly, the passenger door was no longer a barrier. The peace of the cabin was shattered by a violent, frantic energy. Jean did not have time to scream before the first blow landed. The space inside the Fiat, which had felt like a sanctuary, was instantly transformed into a narrow, inescapable trap. The smell of the jungle, the damp, rotting vegetation seemed to pour into the car, mixing with the sharp, metallic scent that always follows a wound. She was pinned against the door, her breath caught in her throat as the world narrowed down to the glint of steel. Carthagesu would later tell the police that as he was standing by the trees, he was struck from behind by a phantom attacker. He claimed he was knocked unconscious, falling face down into the red dust of the shoulder. He said he remained there for nearly 20 minutes. The world, a black void, while the life of the woman in the car was being systematically extinguished. When he woke, he found himself alone in the dark, the white Fiat sitting just a few yards away, its headlights still shining uselessly into the empty road ahead. Passing motorists were the ones who finally stopped. They saw the car parked on the shoulder, its interior lights on, revealing a gruesome tableau. They found Carthagesu lying on the ground, seemingly dazed, and Jean Perera Sinnappa slumped over in the passenger seat. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest with a ferocity that suggested a deep, personal rage. The car doors were locked from the inside, and nothing of value, not her jewelry, not her purse, had been taken. It was a murder that served no purpose other than the death of the victim. When the police arrived, they were immediately struck by the inconsistencies of the scene. Carthagesu claimed to have been knocked out for 20 minutes. Yet a medical examination found no significant trauma to his head, no swelling, no browsing, nothing that would explain such a long period of unconsciousness. Furthermore, the federal highway was one of the busiest roads in the country. The idea that a killer could strike a man, murder a woman in a lit car, and vanish without being seen by a single passing driver felt like a statistical impossibility. The investigation into the death of the beauty queen became a national sensation. It was the first time in Malaysian legal history that a case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. The police discovered a hidden cache of love letters that Carthagesu had written to Jean Obsessive. Desperate notes that revealed a man who could not reconcile his brother's memory with his own growing desire for the woman left behind. He had become her protector, her shadow, and eventually, the primary suspect in her death. He was sentenced to death, the weight of his obsession his undoing. However, the story did not end with a clear resolution. 2 years into his sentence, the key witness who had placed Carthagesu at the scene with a knife confessed that he had been pressured by the police to lie. Without that testimony, the case collapsed, and Carthagesu was released, a free man who would spend the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion. No one else was ever charged with the murder. The white Fiat was eventually sold, its upholstery scrubbed clean of the evidence, but the memory of what happened inside it remained a permanent stain on the highway. Jean's 3 children were left to grow up in a world where their mother's face was on every newspaper. Her beauty, a tragic footnote to a mystery that would never be solved. They lived in the silence of a house where the truth was a ghost that everyone knew but no one dared to name. The federal highway continued to hum with the sound of thousands of cars, the drivers passing the spot near Kuala Lumpur without ever knowing that for one woman, the road didn't lead home, it simply stopped in the dark. Sometimes the most dangerous place you can be is not in a remote valley or a deep cave, but right in the middle of a crowd, where the noise of other people's lives is loud enough to drown out a cry for help. It is the illusion of safety that is the most treacherous. The belief that as long as the lights are on and the cars are passing, nothing truly bad can happen. But the earth has a way of swallowing the things we think are secure, turning a solid ridge into a field of debris in a single, deafening heartbeat. In the late summer of 1971, the small village of Benaujan in southern Spain was a place of whitewashed walls and heavy, golden heat. The surrounding mountains of the Sierra de Lebar stood like jagged, sun-bleached teeth against a sky that was almost painfully blue. For most, the heat was something to be endured in the shade of a patio. But for a specific group of men, the real world existed beneath the limestone, where the air was always 12 degrees and the sun never reached. Modesto, Miguel, and Juan were not casual hobbyists. They were men who found their rhythm in the mechanical click of a carabiner and the focused, rhythmic scrape of a boot against wet stone. To them, speleology was not just a sport, it was a form of meditation that required total presence. Modesto was the eldest, a man with hands calloused by years of rope work and eyes that had grown accustomed to the narrow, flickering world of a headlamp. He moved with a deliberate, feline economy of motion. For these men, the Hundidero Gato cave system was the ultimate cathedral. It is a massive, complex underground labyrinth where a river disappears into a mountain at one end and emerges 4 kilometers later through a colossal opening known as the mouth of the cat. Inside, the limestone has been carved over millions of years into vast galleries and tight, twisting chimneys. It was a place of profound, ancient beauty, but it was also a place that demanded a constant, humble respect for the geology above. Their preparation for the September expedition was a ritual of precision. In the weeks leading up to the trip, they spent hours in a small workshop, meticulously checking their nylon ropes for frays and testing their carbide lamps. They spoke very little during these sessions, the silence filled only by the metallic tinkling of their gear. They packed their bags with the weight of experience, carrying only the essentials: extra batteries, thermal blankets, and a few high-calorie rations, including a single bar of chocolate. Miguel was the team's navigator, a man who could read the subtle ripples in a cave wall like a map. He had a quiet, intense personality and a memory for every squeeze and drop they had ever conquered. He enjoyed the way the cave stripped life down to the immediate, the next handhold, the next breath, the next 10 feet of darkness. In the world above, there were bills and politics and the noise of the 1970s. But down there, the only thing that mattered was the steady pulse of the group. Juan, the youngest of the 3, was the one who captured the beauty of their world. He often carried a heavy waterproof camera case, stopping to photograph the translucent stalactites that hung from the ceilings like frozen glass. He was fascinated by the way their lights would catch the mineral deposits, turning a gray chamber into a glittering palace for a few brief seconds. He found a strange kind of peace in the absolute isolation, the knowledge that they were standing where few humans had ever been. They understood the psychology of the deep earth. They knew that when you are hundreds of feet below the surface, your brain begins to interpret the silence as a physical weight. It is a sensory deprivation that can make a man feel as though he is floating in a void, disconnected from the concept of time. To combat this, they relied on their routines and the constant, reassuring sound of each other's movements. They were a single organism, three parts of a whole, bonded by the shared trust of the rope. The village of Benaujan watched them prepare with a mixture of curiosity and a deep-seated, traditional caution. The locals knew the cave as a living thing. They had seen the river that flowed through it turn from a gentle stream into a roaring monster after a heavy rain, a phenomenon that could happen in a matter of hours. But the forecast for that weekend was clear, and the men were confident. They had navigated these tunnels dozens of times before, and they knew every turn of the main gallery. On the morning of the expedition, the sun was already baking the red earth as they approached the mouth of the cave. The entrance was a towering, arched shadow that exhaled a constant, cool mist. They paused for a moment to let their eyes adjust. The transition from the blinding Spanish sun to the eternal twilight of the cave being a threshold they always respected. They checked their lamps one last time. The hiss of the gas, a familiar, comforting sound that signaled the beginning of their journey. As they moved deeper into the mountain, the sounds of the surface world, the cicadas, the wind in the dry grass, the distant barking of a dog faded into a total, velvet silence. Their world became the circle of light cast by their lamps, illuminating the wet limestone and the dark, still pools of the underground river. They moved with a synchronized grace, their boots finding purchase on the slick rock with instinctive ease. For the first few hours, it was a routine trip, a familiar dance in the dark. I should mention that the geology of southern Spain is dominated by karst limestone, which acts like a massive, porous sponge. When rain falls on the mountains above, it doesn't just run off the surface, it drains rapidly through thousands of tiny cracks and sinkholes, collecting in hidden reservoirs deep within the rock. This means that a storm miles away can suddenly pressurize a cave system, turning a dry tunnel into a high-pressure fire hose in minutes, a process that is as invisible as it is deadly. They reached the middle section of the system, a series of narrow passages known as siphons. A siphon is a point where the ceiling of the cave dips down below the water level, requiring a diver to pass through. During the dry season, these siphons often have a small pocket of air at the top, allowing cavers to scramble through with only their legs submerged. They moved through the first two with ease, the water cool against their skin, the echoes of their splashing following them like ghosts. The first distortion of their reality was not a sight, but a sound. It was a low-frequency vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the soft tissue of their chests. It was a deep, guttural hum, like the sound of a distant jet engine or a landslide happening in slow motion. Modesto stopped, his hand raised to signal the others. They stood perfectly still, their lamps cutting through the dark, and they felt the air change. The cool, stagnant mist was suddenly being pushed by a heavy, humid draft. The vibration grew into a rhythmic thudding, and then they heard it, the unmistakable roar of rushing water. It wasn't the gentle trickle they were used to. It was a violent, chaotic sound that grew louder with every second. Miguel looked at the wall and saw a thin line of mud beginning to weep from a crack. The clear, green pools of the river were suddenly turning a thick, opaque brown, churning with foam and debris. The mountain was beginning to drain, and they were standing in the drain pipe. They turned back immediately, their movements now fueled by a cold, sharp adrenaline. They scrambled toward the last siphon they had passed. But when they reached it, the air pocket was gone. The water had risen 3 feet in a matter of minutes, sealing the exit with a wall of churning, chocolate-colored liquid. The sound was now a deafening, physical force that made it impossible to speak. They were trapped in a high-altitude chamber, a limestone bubble that was rapidly becoming a pressurized tomb. They retreated to the highest point they could find, a massive gallery called the Sala de las Dunas, where a large sand dune had been deposited by ancient floods. They sat on the cold, damp sand, their lamps dimmed to save fuel, and watched the water continue to rise. It stopped just inches below their feet, a dark, swirling mirror that reflected the terror in their eyes. The roar of the water was now so loud that it felt like it was vibrating in their very teeth and the marrow of their bones. The silence that followed the initial surge was even more terrifying. It was the silence of three men who realized they were now living on the wrong side of the world. They knew that on the surface, no one would even know they were in trouble until they failed to emerge the following evening. They were hundreds of feet beneath a mountain of solid rock, and the only way out was currently a 50-meter deep underwater tunnel filled with mud and jagged debris. They were no longer explorers, they were prisoners. You are sitting on a cold, shifting pile of sand in a darkness, so absolute it feels like a physical weight against your eyelids. The air is thick with the scent of wet earth and the metallic tang of your own fear. And every time you breathe, you feel the damp chill of the mountain stealing the heat from your lungs. The only thing you can hear is the slow, rhythmic drip of water from a stalactite, each drop sounding like a hammer blow in the void. You are waiting for a rescue that may never come. On the surface, the village was hit by a torrential downpour that turned the streets into rivers. When the men did not return, the alarm was raised, and a massive rescue operation began. The Spanish Civil Guard and Navy divers arrived, their trucks and equipment lining the road to the cave. They looked into the mouth of the cat and saw a wall of white water pouring out with such force that it could strip the paint from a car. The mountain was purging itself, and there was no way for any human to enter. For the next 10 days, the world watched the mouth of the cave. The divers made several attempts to penetrate the flooded siphons, but the current was too strong and the visibility was zero. They were diving into a liquid forest of mud and rock. On the surface, the families of the three men sat in a vigil, their faces pale under the flickering lights of the rescue camp. The hope was fading with every passing hour. No one could survive 10 days in that cold, damp darkness without food or proper warmth. Inside the Sala de las Dunas, time had lost all meaning. The three men had established a grim, silent routine. They sat close together to share body heat, their thermal blankets wrapped tight. They rationed their single bar of chocolate, eating one tiny square each day. The sugar, a brief, electric shock to their starving systems. They spoke in whispers, terrified that the sound of their voices would somehow trigger another collapse or a rise in the water. They were waiting in a state of suspended animation. Modesto found himself fixated on the tiny, rhythmic tick of his waterproof watch. It was the only thing that linked him to the world above. He found himself thinking that if he could just keep the watch ticking, he could keep his heart beating. It was a fragile, irrational logic, but it was the only thing that kept the panic from swallowing him whole. He looked at Miguel and Juan, their faces pale and gaunt in the dim glow of a single lamp, and he felt a sudden, fierce love for these men. On the 7th day, a rescue team on the surface used a high-sensitivity seismic microphone, pressing it against the side of the mountain nearly a mile from the entrance. They sat in absolute silence, headphones pressed to their ears, and they heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a rock hitting a cave wall. A deliberate, human signal transmitted through hundreds of feet of solid limestone. The men were alive. The mountain had not taken them yet. The final breakthrough came on the 10th day. The water level finally began to recede as the mountain finished its purge. The Navy divers, exhausted and covered in mud, managed to push through the final, murky siphon. When their lights finally broke the surface of the pool in the Sala de las Dunas, they saw three figures standing on the sand dune. The men were skeletal, their eyes wide and dilated, but they were standing. They had held on to their sanity and each other in the absolute void. The rescue was a slow, agonizing process. The men were so weak, they had to be carried through the narrowest passages, their bodies limp as the divers navigated the receding water. When they finally emerged from the mouth of the cat, the sun was just beginning to rise over the Sierra de Libar. The light was so bright, it felt like a physical blow to their eyes. The cheers of the village were a distant, muffled roar, a sound they hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. I noticed a detail in the records that says when Juan was finally brought into the light, he was still clutching his waterproof camera case. He hadn't taken a single photo during the 10 days. When someone asked him why he bothered to carry it through the flood, he simply said that he didn't want to forget what the light looked like. It is a strange irony that in a place of such profound, ancient beauty, the only thing that truly mattered in the end was a simple, mechanical piece of plastic. The investigation into the incident led to a complete overhaul of caving safety protocols in Spain. It was determined that a localized weather phenomenon known as a cold drop had dumped a month's worth of rain on the peaks in a matter of hours, a surge the men could not have predicted. The cave system was mapped with even greater precision, and new emergency shelters were established. But for the men who were there, the map was already etched into their very souls, a geography of shadows and sound. The men recovered, but they were never quite the same. Modesto eventually retired from elite speleology, finding that he could no longer stand the sound of dripping water in a quiet room. Miguel and Juan continued to climb, but they never returned to the Cueva del Gato. They had seen the mountain's true face, a face of cold, indifferent power that could turn a cathedral into a coffin without a second thought. They lived the rest of their lives with a quiet, heavy residue of that 10-day silence. The mouth of the cat still stands today, a towering arch of limestone that breathes a cool, damp mist into the Spanish heat. On a clear day, it looks peaceful, an inviting gateway to a hidden world. But when the clouds begin to gather over the Sierra de Libar and the air starts to turn heavy and humid, the locals still look toward the mountain with a silent, knowing respect. They know that the cave is never truly empty, it is always waiting, exhaling the ghosts of 1971. Sometimes, what breaks a person is not the danger itself. It is the moment just before it. When everything still looks completely normal, it is the single piece of chocolate, the ticking watch, or the camera case held tight in the dark. In our next case, what remained was not a piece of equipment, but a single piece of paper left on a kitchen counter. A small white rectangle that held the weight of a disappearance that no one saw coming. In 1972, the Ottawa Valley was a place defined by its vastness and its silence. To the people who lived there, the landscape was not just a setting, it was a constant, living presence that demanded a specific kind of respect. The Canadian Shield is a rugged, ancient terrain of granite and deep water, where the pine trees grow thick and the lakes are often so isolated that they don't even have names. It is a beautiful country, but it is a place where a person can feel very small very quickly, especially when the sun begins to dip behind the jagged line of the horizon. Murray McNaughton was a man who understood the rhythm of this land. He was a father of 4, a hard-working man who lived in the small town of Arnprior, and he found his greatest peace on the water. For Murray, fishing was more than a hobby. It was a ritual that connected him to his family and to the quiet power of the Ontario bush. He was a man of routine and steady hands. The kind of father who made sure the life jackets were buckled tight and the bait was fresh before the station wagon ever pulled out of the driveway for a weekend trip. On the morning of June 12th, the air was already heavy with the promise of a warm summer. Murray had spent the early hours gathering the gear, his movements methodical and calm. He checked the fishing rods, running his fingers along the line to feel for any nicks or weaknesses. He packed the tackle box with lures that had been passed down through his family, their bright colors worn and chipped from years of use. There was a sense of quiet anticipation in the house, a feeling that this was going to be one of those perfect, long afternoons where the fish would be biting and the world would feel right. 5-year-old Adrien McNaughton was the youngest of the group, a bright, verbal boy with a curiosity that often outpaced his physical size. He was a child of the outdoors, comfortable with the dirt and the bugs, and he possessed a wandering spirit that Murray watched with a mixture of pride and caution. Adrien wore a colorful windbreaker that morning, a bright splash of nylon against the muted greens and browns of the woods. He carried his own small, blue-handled fishing rod, a prized possession that made him feel like one of the men, and he gripped it with a fierce, childish determination. The drive to Holmes Lake was a familiar journey, a path through winding dirt roads where the dust kicked up in thick, red clouds behind the car. The lake itself was a secluded spot, favored by locals for its pike and bass. But it was not an easy place to navigate. One section of the shore was known as the Stumps, an area where the water was shallow and filled with the skeletal remains of drowned trees. It was a haunting, submerged forest, where the visibility was poor, and the silt on the bottom was so fine it could swallow a boot if you stepped in the wrong place. Murray steered the car toward the edge of the water, the engine ticking as it cooled in the shade of the pines. The children piled out, their voices ringing through the trees, a sound that seemed to be swallowed instantly by the vast, absorbent silence of the woods. Murray led them toward the shore, carrying the heavy cooler and the extra gear, his eyes scanning the water for ripples. The lake was as smooth as glass that afternoon, a dark, heavy mirror that reflected the deep blue of the sky and the white, towering clouds that were drifting slowly toward the north. They settled near the edge of the stumps, and Murray began the task of untangling lines and baiting hooks. It was a slow process with 4 children, but Murray didn't mind the work. He enjoyed the focus it required, the way the world narrowed down to the tiny eye of a hook and the wriggling weight of a worm. He watched Adrien out of the corner of his eye, the boy standing at the water's edge, his blue-handled rod poised for action. The sunlight caught the blonde hair at the back of the boy's head, making him look like a small, glowing anchor in the middle of the wilderness. The afternoon passed in a series of small, quiet victories. There were nibbles on the lines, the excitement of a caught fish, and the steady, rhythmic sound of the water lapping against the shore. The bugs were out in force, a constant, high-pitched hum that vibrated in the air. But the McNaughtons were used to the sting of the bush. They moved through the heat with a practiced ease, their bodies becoming part of the landscape. To any observer, it was a picture of perfect, unshakable normalcy, a family building a memory in the heart of the Canadian Shield. Adrien was a child who spoke his mind, and after a few hours of standing by the water, he decided he had had enough of the fishing. He told his father he was tired and wanted to go and sit down for a while. Murray nodded, gesturing toward a patch of shade near the tree line, only about 20 feet from where the rest of the family was standing. He watched Adrien walk away, the boy's bright windbreaker flickering between the trunks of the pines until he sat down on a fallen log. Murray turned back to the water, his attention shifting to his daughter's tangled reel. The sound of the lake is a strange thing. It is composed of 1,000 tiny noises that blend into a single, deceptive silence. There is the creak of the trees, the rustle of the wind in the brush, and the soft, repetitive slap of the waves. It is a sound that can mask a footstep or a sigh, creating a curtain of white noise that makes it difficult to tell where one sound ends and another begins. Murray worked on the reel, his fingers moving with practiced speed, while the chatter of the other children provided a steady, reassuring backdrop to his thoughts. It had been less than 5 minutes since Adrien walked toward the trees. Murray finished the repair and looked up, expecting to see the bright nylon of his son's jacket against the dark bark of the pines. But the log was empty. The patch of shade was still there, the light filtering through the branches in long, dusty shafts. But the boy was nowhere to be seen. Murray felt a small, cold twitch of unease in the base of his stomach, the kind of feeling a father gets when the rhythm of the world suddenly skips a beat without warning. He called Adrien's name, his voice sounding thin and small against the vast expanse of the lake. There was no answer. He called again, louder this time, his eyes searching the brush for any sign of movement. The other children stopped their talking, the sudden silence of the family amplifying the silence of the woods. Murray walked toward the log where he had last seen his son, his boots crunching on the dry needles with a sound that felt unnecessarily loud. He reached the spot, but the grass was barely pressed down, and the blue-handled rod was nowhere to be found. It is a common misconception that a person in danger in the woods will make a lot of noise. In reality, The Canadian bush has a way of absorbing sound like a sponge, especially when the ground is soft and the trees are thick. A child can step off a trail and be completely hidden within seconds, their voice drowned out by the heavy, humid air and the constant hum of the insects. Murray realized with a suddenness, sharp clarity, that his son had not made a single sound as he disappeared. It was as if the boy had simply walked out of existence. He began to move faster, his calls becoming more frequent and more desperate. He circled the area near the log, pushing through the thick brush, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. He checked the edge of the water, peering into the murky depths of the stumps. But the surface was undisturbed, the dark silt resting in a thick, heavy layer at the bottom. The panic was a physical pressure now, a weight in his lungs that made it difficult to draw a full breath. He told the other children to stay exactly where they were. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the local police and a handful of volunteers had arrived at Holmes Lake. The transition from a peaceful family outing to a full-scale search and rescue operation was jarring. A sudden intrusion of flashing lights and barking orders into the quiet of the wilderness. Murray stood on the shore, his face pale and drawn, his hands shaking as he tried to explain exactly where Adrien had been standing. Every minute that passed felt like a physical blow, a piece of his son's chances being chipped away by the encroaching dark. As night fell, the temperature in the valley dropped rapidly, the heat of the day replaced by a sharp, biting chill. The searchers moved through the woods with powerful flashlights, the beams cutting through the dark like white swords. They called Adrien's name in a rhythmic, haunting chorus that echoed across the water. But the only response was the distant, lonely cry of a loon. The woods had become a labyrinth of shadows, every tree looking like a person, every rustle of the wind sounding like a child's footstep on the dry, brittle leaves. The geography of the Holmes Lake area is particularly treacherous for a search. The ground is a patchwork of granite ridges and swampy bogs, where a single misstep can lead to a fall into a crevice or a sinkhole. To the searchers, the land felt predatory, a vast and indifferent machine that was designed to hide whatever fell into its cracks. They moved slowly, checking every hollow and every thicket, their movements hindered by the dense undergrowth and the total, suffocating darkness that seemed to press in from all sides, or as if the night itself were a physical obstacle. Over the next few days, the search grew into one of the largest in Ontario's history. 9,000 volunteers descended on the area, including soldiers from the nearby military base and hundreds of local residents who left their jobs and their families to help find a boy they had never met. They formed long lines, walking shoulder to shoulder through the bush, their eyes fixed on the ground. They found plenty of things: old rusted cans, discarded scraps of fabric, animal bones, but they did not find a single trace of Adrien McNaughton, not a footprint, not a thread from his jacket. The search divers focused on the stumps, the area of the lake that Murray feared the most. Underwater, the environment was a nightmare of zero visibility and submerged obstacles. The silt on the bottom of Holmes Lake is a unique geological feature. It is composed of fine organic matter that has accumulated over thousands of years, forming a layer that is as light as ash. When a diver's fin or a hand touches the bottom, this silt does not just drift, it explodes in a thick, blinding cloud that can hang in the water for hours, turning the environment into a world of liquid smoke. The sensation of being underwater in that lake was like being buried alive in a cold, fluid grave. You move through a world where there is no up or down, only the heavy, dark pressure of the water against your skin. Your hands reach out and touch the slimy, rotting bark of a submerged tree, and the moment your fingers make contact, the world disappears into a cloud of brown silt that swallows the light from your lamp. You are breathing through a regulator, the hiss of the air, the only sound in the void, and you realize that you could be inches from what you are looking for and never even know it. Murray stayed at the lake for the entire search, sleeping in his car and walking the shoreline until his boots were falling apart. He watched the divers emerge from the water, their faces caked in the dark, stinking mud of the lake bottom, and he saw the same look of defeat in their eyes every time. He found himself thinking about the silence again, the way his son had just stepped away without a word. It was a thought that haunted him, the idea that a human life could be so easily and quietly erased by a patch of trees and a few feet of water. The investigation eventually turned toward other possibilities. A witness reported seeing a custom-painted Dodge car parked near the lake entrance on the morning of the disappearance, a vehicle that had vanished before the search began. This opened the door to the terrifying theory of abduction. The idea that Adrien had not wandered into the woods, but had been taken by someone who had been waiting for that 5-minute window of silence. But like every other lead in the case, the mystery car remained a phantom, a piece of information that led to a dead end. In 2016, a new search was launched using modern technology that didn't exist in 1972. 4 professional cadaver dogs, trained to detect the scent of human remains even after decades, were taken out on a boat to the center of Holmes Lake. Each dog, working independently and without any cues from the others, alerted at the exact same coordinate in the area of the stumps. It was a chilling, scientific confirmation of what Murray had feared for 40 years, that his son was still there, resting under the heavy, blinding silt of the lake that had taken him. The silt makes recovery almost impossible. To disturb the bottom is to lose the target, and the depth of the organic matter means that remains could be buried several feet deep within the muck. It is a place where the earth has decided to keep what it took, a geological vault that is protected by the very physics of the water. Adrien McNaughton is still 5 years old, still wearing his bright windbreaker, resting in a place where the sun never reaches and the silence is absolute. He is a part of the lake now, a part of the ancient history of the Ottawa Valley. Murray McNaughton lived the rest of his life with a quiet, heavy hole in his heart, a space that could never be filled by anything else. He never stopped looking at the trees, never stopped wondering if there was one small detail he had missed, one sound he should have heard. He understood that the wilderness is not a place of malice, but a place of indifference, and that sometimes the only thing left after a tragedy is the silence of the land and the memory of a boy with a blue-handled fishing rod who just wanted to go and sit down for a while. The silence of the woods is a heavy thing, but it is a weight that eventually becomes familiar. It is the sound of a story that ended without a final page, leaving behind a residue of questions that can never be answered by the light of day. But there are other kinds of silences, ones that are not found in the wilderness, but in the middle of a city where thousands of people are watching, yet no one sees the moment the world shifts. In our next case, the noise of a crowd becomes the perfect shroud for a disappearance that was hidden in plain sight. In 1973, the city of Brasília was a vision of the future, made of white concrete and sharp, geometric edges. It was a planned capital, a place of wide, sterile boulevards and monumental architecture that looked like it had been dropped into the heart of the Brazilian plateau from another planet. For 7-year-old Lídia Braga, the city was simply home, a place of bright, dry sunlight and the fine, blood-red dust that settled on everything she owned, no matter how often her mother swept the floors. Lídia was a child who seemed to embody the optimism of her middle-class neighborhood. She had bright blonde hair and deep blue eyes, and she was almost always seen wearing her neat school uniform, finished with a single pink ribbon tied perfectly into a bow. Her life was a series of predictable, safe rhythms: breakfast in the sun-drenched kitchen, the short drive to school, and the quiet afternoons spent playing with her dolls. She was a gentle child, the kind who trusted the adults in her world to keep the sharp edges of the city at bay. The school she attended, the Colégio Madre Carmen Celeste, was a fortress of order and discipline. Every morning, the gates would open to a sea of children in identical uniforms, a scene that felt like a reassuring part of the city's utopian design. On the morning of September 11th, Anna's older brother, Álvaro, was the one to drop her off. He watched her walk toward the entrance, a small, bright figure against the gray brutalist walls, her pink ribbon bobbing with every step. He assumed she had passed through the doors, just as she had done every day before. But the city of Brasília in 1973 was also a place of hidden layers and whispered fears. Brazil was under the iron grip of a military dictatorship, and the gleaming white buildings of the capital housed men who operated with a terrifying level of impunity. There was a secret geometry to the city, a hierarchy where the children of the elite moved in a different world than everyone else. As Ana Lídia approached the gate, she was stopped not by a stranger, but by someone who seemed to belong in that secure world. Someone she recognized and trusted enough to take by the hand. Inside the classroom, the teacher noted the empty chair where Ana Lídia should have been sitting. At first, it was assumed she was simply home with a cold. But as the hours passed and the seat remained empty, a slow, cold vibration of unease began to settle in the teacher's chest. By mid-afternoon, the phone rang in the Braga household. When her mother realized that Ana had never walked through the school doors, the sterile, orderly world of Brasília suddenly fractured. The wide boulevards no longer felt like a triumph of design. They felt like vast, empty canyons where a child could be lost forever. The search began as the sun was dipping toward the horizon, turning the white concrete of the city into a pale, ghostly orange. Álvaro and his parents moved through the neighborhood, their voices sounding thin and desperate against the dry wind. They checked the playgrounds, the shops, and the homes of her friends, but the response was always the same, a slow shake of the head and a look of growing pity. The city felt predatory now. The shadows of the brutalist apartment blocks stretching out like long, dark fingers across the red soil of the plateau, reaching for anything that was left unprotected. The heat is a suffocating, dry weight that tastes like iron and old copper, and the silence of the Cerrado at midnight is so heavy it feels like it's pressing the air right out of your lungs. You are standing in a field of twisted trees and waist-high grass, and the only sound is the rhythmic, rasping chirp of the crickets, a noise that vibrates in the back of your throat. You look down at a patch of disturbed earth, the red dust swirling in the beam of your flashlight, and you think, please let this be anything else. But the weight in your chest already knows the truth. The next morning, a search team found the small grave in a remote field near the University of Brasília. The scene was one of ritualistic brutality that shocked even the most hardened investigators. Ana Lídia's body bore the marks of cigarette burns and prolonged torture. Her blonde hair had been violently shorn, and the clumps of hair lay scattered in the dirt like dead leaves. Amidst the horror of the scene, one detail stood out with a heartbreaking clarity. Her pink hair ribbon sat in the red dust, perfectly intact, the only thing the killers hadn't managed to destroy. As the detectives began to dig into the case, they quickly encountered a wall that was thicker than any concrete monument in the city. The primary suspects were not drifters or strangers, but the sons of high-ranking government officials, including the son of a cabinet minister and Ana's own brother, Álvaro. These were the untouchables, young men who spent their nights in the dark corners of the city, fueled by drugs and the knowledge that the law did not apply to them. The police station, once a place of supposed justice, became a theater of intimidation and suppressed evidence. The secret police, known as the DOPS, moved in with a silent, terrifying efficiency. Files began to disappear from locked drawers. Biological samples were accidentally incinerated in the station furnace. Witnesses who had seen Ana Lídia being led away by a man in a suit were suddenly visited by men in dark glasses who suggested that their memories were faulty. The pressure was not loud or explosive. It was a steady, cold squeezing of the truth until it was unrecognizable. The military government valued the stability of its elite more than the life of a 7-year-old girl. The reconstruction of that final night suggests a scenario of cold-blooded leverage. It is widely believed that Ana Lídia was used as a pawn, a human payment to settle a high-stakes drug debt involving the sons of the political elite. She was taken to a private location, a place of concrete and shadows, where her innocence was traded for the silence of powerful men. The brutality of the act was not just a crime, it was a message a demonstration of the absolute power held by those who walked the halls of the capital. The pink ribbon was the only thing that refused to be erased. No one was ever punished for the murder of Lídia Braga. The trial was a scripted performance, a farce designed to lead to the inevitable acquittal of the well-connected suspects. The case eventually reached the statute of limitations in 1993, officially closing the book on a crime that an entire nation knew the answer to. The killers grew up, moved into positions of power, and lived their lives in the very white buildings that Lídia had passed on her last morning. The red dust of Brasília eventually covered the tracks, but it could never quite bury the memory. She remains a symbol of the lead years in Brazil, a reminder of a time when the future was built on top of a shallow grave. Her name is still whispered in the neighborhoods of the capital, a ghost that haunts the wide boulevards and the sterile, geometric parks. The silence of the city is not the silence of peace, but the silence of a truth that was strangled in its crib to protect the comfort of the powerful. The pink ribbon is gone now, but the echo of that September morning still rings through the red dust, a sound that refuses to fade. That happened in 1973, thousands of miles away. In that same year, another group of people was climbing toward the sky, unaware that the thin, freezing air of the Andes was already changing how they thought, turning trusted friends into shadows and memory into a ghost on a roll of film. In 2020, the blue ice of the Polish glacier on Mount Aconcagua began to surrender a secret it had kept for nearly 50 years. A mountain porter was navigating a steep, rocky section near 19,000 feet when he spotted a glint of metal and weather-worn leather emerging from the melting silt. It was a Nicomat 35mm camera, still tucked inside its original case. Lashed to the strap was a small, handwritten tag from a camera shop in Denver, Colorado. The name on the tag belonged to a woman who had walked onto this mountain in 1973 and never walked off. Janet Johnson was a 36-year-old librarian from Denver who lived a life that was quiet, organized, and deeply focused. In her daily world, she moved between rows of neatly cataloged books, her fingers accustomed to the smooth texture of paper and the specific, dusty scent of a library at dusk. She was a woman of systems and logic, someone who found comfort in the fact that every question had a place where the answer was filed. She lived alone in a small apartment that reflected this same sense of order, with every object placed with a deliberate, quiet purpose. She was not a person who sought the spotlight, yet she possessed a physical toughness that surprised those who only saw the librarian in her wool cardigans. On the weekends, she traded the air-conditioned silence of the stacks for the thin, biting air of the Colorado Rockies. She was an elite climber, a member of the Mazamas Mountaineering Club, and she climbed with a steady, rhythmic intensity. For Janet, the mountains were not about conquest. They were about the clarity that comes when the world is stripped down to the next handhold and the sound of your own breathing. John Cooper was 35 years old, a NASA engineer who spent his days analyzing telemetry and the complex physics of spaceflight. He was a man who lived in the realm of high-precision data, where a decimal point in the wrong place could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. He had a sharp, analytical mind and a lean, athletic build that he pushed to the limit during his time away from the office. He looked at a mountain the way he looked at a launch sequence, a series of technical problems that could be solved with enough preparation and discipline. Both Janet and John were part of a team of 8 climbers from the Mazamas Club who traveled to Argentina in early 1973 to take on Aconcagua, the highest peak in the Western Hemisphere. They were experienced, well-equipped, and deeply respectful of the mountain. They spent weeks at base camp, acclimating to the altitude and watching the sky for the telltale signs of the viento blanco, the white wind that can turn the summit into a screaming, lethal vortex in a matter of minutes. They were a team of experts who believed that logic would always prevail over the elements. The Polish route is a steep, unforgiving climb that requires navigating a vast field of ice and loose rock. As they moved higher, the atmospheric pressure dropped, and the oxygen in their blood began to thin. In 1973, the medical understanding of high-altitude cerebral edema was still developing, but the team knew the symptoms: confusion, irrationality, and a breakdown of the personality. At 20,000 feet, the brain begins to short-circuit, and the very logic that Janet and John relied on for their professional lives started to fray at the edges. The expedition began to fracture as they reached the high-altitude camps. Some members were suffering from severe exhaustion, while others began to argue over the best route forward. The group dynamic, once solid and professional, was being eroded by the lack of oxygen. There is a specific kind of psychological pressure that occurs when you are standing on the roof of the world. You are physically depleted. Your brain is starving, and every decision feels like a life or death struggle. The librarian and the engineer found themselves in a group that was slowly losing its way. A sharp observation about this environment is that high-altitude psychosis doesn't always look like madness. Sometimes it looks like a simple, stubborn refusal to accept reality, where a person becomes fixated on a single goal while ignoring the obvious signs of their own physical collapse. This is how a team of elite climbers can stand in the middle of a storm and convince themselves that they are perfectly fine, even as their bodies are shutting down. It is a medical irony that the higher you climb, the less you are able to trust the very mind that got you there in the first place. On the night of January 25th, the weather turned. The viento blanco arrived with a sound like a freight train, a deafening, high-pitched roar that vibrated in the very bones of the climbers. The temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, and the visibility vanished into a swirling wall of white powder. The team was scattered across the Polish glacier, huddled in tents that were being shredded by the wind. Janet and John were separated from the main group, along with two other climbers, and they were forced to make a desperate choice about whether to stay or descend. The decision was made to split the group further. Two climbers began a descent in the whiteout, while Janet and John remained high on the mountain. What happened next has been the subject of nearly 50 years of debate and whispered rumors. When the surviving members of the expedition finally reached safety, their stories were conflicting and clouded by the trauma of the storm. They spoke of mercy killings, of love triangles that had soured in the thin air, and of a moment where the thin veneer of civilization was stripped away by the sheer desperation of the Andean winter. John Cooper's body was found 2 years later by an Argentine search team. He was lying on a steep slope, his face frozen in an expression of profound wide-eyed terror. But it was the nature of his injuries that disturbed the rescuers. He had a perfect, cylindrical hole in his abdomen, a wound so precise that no fall could explain it. Forensic experts who examined the photos decades later noted that the hole matched the diameter of a standard climbing ice screw. The suggestion was that someone had used a piece of mountaineering equipment as a weapon in the middle of the storm. Janet Johnson's body was not found until 1975. She was lying nearly 2,000 feet away from John, in a relatively flat area that should have been safe. Her face had been smashed by a heavy impact, and she was wearing clothing that was completely unsuitable for the summit. She was missing her heavy parka and one of her gloves. It looked as if she had been wandering in a state of total disorientation, or perhaps she had been discarded by someone who was moving too fast to help her. The mystery of their deaths became a dark legend in the climbing community. The setting of the Polish glacier is a vertical wasteland of blue ice and gray scree, where the wind never stops and the air is so thin it feels like breathing through a wet cloth. You are standing on a slope so steep that one misstep means a 3,000-foot slide into the abyss. The sky is a deep, bruised purple, and the only sound is the rhythmic, mechanical rasp of your own breath and the high-pitched whistle of the wind through your gear. You look at your partner, but their goggles are frosted over, and you realize you have no idea who is actually standing behind the glass. The pressure in this narrow space is not just environmental. It is the weight of realizing that your brain is no longer functioning. You try to remember the name of your street in Denver, but the words are gone, replaced by a cold, white static. You feel the ice screw in your hand, its metal burning your skin through your glove, and a thought flickers through your mind with the weight of an anchor: if I don't stop him, Neither of us will ever get home. This is the moment where the engineer and the librarian were replaced by something primal and desperate, high above the clouds. When the porter found the camera in 2020, the film inside was miraculously intact. The New York Times took the roll to a specialized lab where the frames were developed for the first time in half a century. The photos showed Janet and John in the days leading up to the storm. They looked haggard, their faces burned by the sun and etched with the strain of the altitude. But they were smiling. They looked like people who were still in control. The final photo on the roll was a blurry shot of the horizon, the sun setting over the Andes, a final witness to the beauty they had sought. The developed film also revealed a devastating truth. Some of the photos appeared to have been taken after the point where the survivors claimed Janet and John had died. It suggested that the pair had been alive and moving long after they had been abandoned by their teammates. The camera, which Janet had used to document her life with such precision in Denver, had become a silent, mechanical witness to a betrayal that took 50 years to come to light. The photos did not show the murder, but they showed the two of them standing together, lost but still fighting. As the storm closed in, the current update on this case is that while the Argentine authorities officially ruled the deaths as an accident due to exposure, the Mazamas Club conducted their own internal review following the discovery of the camera. The conflicting testimonies of the survivors, combined with the forensic evidence of the cylindrical wound and the timing of the photos, has led many to believe that a crime occurred on that glacier. However, because all of the primary witnesses have since passed away or are in their late 80s, the full truth will likely remain buried in the blue ice of the Polish route. Janet Johnson and John Cooper are no longer ghosts of the mountain. They have been returned to their families and buried in the earth they once called home. But the residue of their story remains at 20,000 feet. It is a story about the fragile nature of the human mind and the way that extreme environments can strip away the logic of a librarian and the precision of an engineer. Aconcagua is melting, and as the ice recedes, it continues to give back the objects that were lost to glove. A boat, a camera, each one a small, heavy reminder that the mountain never forgets. People often say that what happens on the summit stays on the summit, as if the altitude creates a separate reality where the rules of the world no longer apply. But the truth is that the things we do in the dark eventually find their way into the light, even if it takes 50 years for the ice to melt. Sometimes a life is defined not by how we lived in the safety of our homes, but by the choices we made when the air ran out and the only thing left was the sound of the wind and the look in a friend's eyes. The Adelaide Oval is one of the most beautiful cricket grounds in the world. A sweep of green grass surrounded by towering Moreton Bay figs and the distant, rolling hills of South Australia. In 1973, on a bright Saturday in August, the stadium was vibrating with the energy of 30,000 people. They were there to watch a high-stakes football match, the kind of event where the collective roar of the crowd can be heard for miles, a physical wall of sound that drowns out the rest of the world. Joanne Ratcliffe was 11 years old, a girl who sat on the edge of her seat with a focused, protective intensity. She had a maturity that went beyond her years, a quality that her parents relied on when it came to her younger siblings or family friends. She wore her hair in neat, dark braids and possessed a quiet, observant nature. To Joanne, the football game was not just a spectacle, it was a responsibility, a chance to show that she could navigate the world of adults with grace and competence. Beside her sat 4-year-old Kirsta Gordon, a small, trusting child with a spill of blonde curls and a laugh that was light and frequent. Kirsty looked up to Joanne as if she were a North Star, a person who knew exactly how the world worked and where the boundaries were. The two families were close, their lives interwoven through years of shared meals and Saturday outings. For the Gordons and the Ratcliffes, the Adelaide Oval was a safe harbor, a place where the community gathered to celebrate. The atmosphere in the Edwin Smith stand was a thick mix of anticipation and the smell of fried snacks. Fans were dressed in their team colors, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic, chanting chorus that seemed to pulse through the very floorboards of the stadium. Joanne held Kirsta's hand as they watched the players move across the field, the bright sunlight catching the white of their uniforms. It was a day of pure, uncomplicated Australian life, the kind of afternoon that feels eternal. There is a specific kind of blindness that occurs in a crowd of 30,000 people. We often assume that because everyone is watching, no one is hidden. But a stadium is actually a labyrinth of private moments, where the sheer volume of bodies creates a fog of anonymity. You can walk 10 feet away from your seat and enter a world where you are a total stranger to everyone who glances your way. In 1973, the idea that a predator could be sitting 3 rows back was unthinkable. Joanne's mother, Kathleen, watched the girls with a relaxed, happy gaze. She saw the way Joanne adjusted Kirsta's sweater when the wind picked up, a small act of care that confirmed why she trusted her daughter so deeply. The Ratcliffes were a family that valued independence. They wanted their children to be capable and alert. In the tight-knit world of Adelaide, the Oval was an extension of their own backyard, a space where the rules of the neighborhood still applied and everyone was a neighbor. Kirsta was restless, her small legs swinging back and forth against the wooden bench. She was fascinated by the colorful crowds and the stray cats that occasionally darted under the bleachers looking for scraps. Every few minutes, she would whisper something to Joanne, her face lighting up with a secret. Joanne would lean in, listening with a serious expression, before nodding and patting the younger girl's knee. They were a self-contained unit, a small island of childhood in the middle of the shouting fans. As the match entered the final quarter, the tension in the stadium reached a fever pitch. The score was close, and every play was met with a deafening, unified reaction that felt like a physical blow to the chest. The sound was not just a noise, it was a pressure that vibrated in the lungs and made the air feel heavy. People were standing, their arms raised, their faces red with exertion. In the middle of this chaos, Joanne and Kirsta asked if they could go to the toilet together. The restroom was located just a short distance from their seats, near the entrance to the Edwin Smith stand. It was a familiar route, one they had taken earlier in the day. Kathleen checked her watch. There were only 15 minutes left in the game. She handed the girls a few coins so they could get a snack on the way back, a small reward for being so well behaved. She watched them walk down the stairs, Joanne leading the way, Kirsta's hand tucked firmly into hers until they vanished. The area around the toilets was a transitional space, a concrete corridor where the roar of the stadium became a muffled, echoing drone. The air here was cooler, smelling of damp stone and the faint, sweet scent of popcorn. People were rushing back and forth, trying to catch the end of the game, their footsteps a frantic, uneven percussion on the hard ground. Joanne and Kirsta moved through this stream of adults like 2 small, determined ships navigating a harbor filled with tankers. Outside the restroom, near the stadium exit, a stray cat was sitting near a patch of sunlight. Kirsta, with the sudden, magnetic focus of a 4-year-old, stopped to pet it. Joanne waited beside her, her eyes scanning the passing crowd. It was a moment of perfect, ordinary vulnerability. A man in a brown felt hat and a gray suit was standing a few feet away. Watching them, he didn't look like a threat. He looked like a grandfather or a tired father waiting for his own children to finish. Joanne felt a small, sharp prick of pride as she led Kirsta toward the stadium exit. She thought to herself that she was doing a good job, that she was exactly the kind of big girl her parents could trust. It was a brief, warm flicker of confidence that would be the last thing she ever felt before the shadow of the man in the hat fell across the grass. She didn't scream because her brain told her that a man in a suit and a hat was a part of the safe world she had always known. By the time the final siren blared and 30,000 people began to pour out of the Adelaide Oval, Kathleen and the Gordons were already standing by the restroom entrance. The initial flicker of concern had turned into a cold, hard knot of fear. They called the girls names, their voices lost in the rushing tide of fans who were laughing and shouting about the game's result. The stadium was no longer a safe harbor. It was a vast, indifferent machine that was discarding its passengers. The police arrived as the sun was starting to set, the long shadows of the Moreton Bay figs stretching across the empty pitch. Witnesses began to come forward, their stories creating a chilling timeline of the 90 minutes after the girls had left their seats. One person reported seeing a man in a brown hat carrying a small blonde girl who looked like she was sleeping. Another saw an older girl following behind them, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the man's back with a look of silent terror. Geographically, the Adelaide Oval sits just a few hundred yards from the Torrens River and the Adelaide Zoo. It is a location that offers 1,000 different ways to vanish into the parklands that surround the city. In 1973, the security was minimal, and the police were initially slow to realize they were dealing with an abduction. They spent hours searching the stadium itself, looking in lockers and storage rooms, while the man in the hat was already walking into the trees. You are walking across the bridge toward the zoo, the concrete hot through the soles of your shoes and the distant sound of the stadium crowd acting as a rhythmic pressure against your spine. You see a man carrying a small child, and for a split second, you lock eyes with the older girl following behind them. Her face is a mask of silent, wide-eyed distress, but your brain rejects the anomaly, telling you it's just a family on a difficult afternoon. You look away, and in that second, they are gone. The search for Joanne and Kirsty became one of the largest in South Australian history. Divers scoured the murky depths of the Torrens River, their hands feeling through the silt and debris. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the parklands, their flashlights cutting through the dark in a desperate, swaying rhythm. They found a few discarded items, a child's shoe, a stray ribbon, but nothing that belonged to the girls. It was as if the stadium had simply inhaled them and refused to let them go. The investigation uncovered a terrifying parallel. 7 years earlier, 3 children had vanished from Glenelg Beach in Adelaide in a case known as the Beaumont Children Disappearance. The man in the hat at the Oval bore a haunting resemblance to the sketches of the person seen with the Beaumonts. The city of Adelaide, which had prided itself on being a quiet, safe community, was forced to confront the idea that a predator was moving through their most public spaces with a terrifying, invisible ease. In 2022, nearly 50 years after the girls vanished, investigators used world-leading facial recognition software to analyze the original police sketches. The system returned a 90% match to a man named Arthur Stanley Brown, a person who had been a suspect in multiple child abductions across Australia. He had died in 2002, taking his secrets with him to the grave. The technology provided a name, but it could not provide a location or the closure the families had sought. The Adelaide Oval still stands, a monument to the city's love for sport and community. But for the Ratcliffes and the Gordons, the stadium is a place where time stopped in the final quarter of an August afternoon. They still wonder why 30,000 people didn't hear the silence that followed the girls as they walked away. The man in the hat remains a phantom, a reminder that the most dangerous people are often the ones who look exactly like everyone else, standing right in the middle of the light. The roar of a crowd can hide many things, but it can never quite drown out the echo of a missing child's name. It is a sound that continues to vibrate in the silence of the parklands, long after the fans have gone home and the lights of the stadium have been turned off. Sometimes the truth doesn't come out in a single dramatic moment. It surfaces slowly, like a piece of gear from a melting glacier, reminding us that the past is never truly buried as deep as we think. From the sun-bleached bridges of South Australia, we move to the coast of Spain, where the water isn't a river, but a thermal abyss that stays warm even in the dead of winter. It is a place where the darkness is not just a lack of light, but a physical substance that can swallow a person in a matter of seconds, leaving behind only the rhythmic, panicked hiss of an oxygen tank. In 1974, the city of Cartagena was a place where the air always seemed to carry a hint of salt and old iron. It was a rugged port town on the Spanish coast, a location defined by its long naval history and the deep, dark Mediterranean that sat at its doorstep. For Juan Jose, 23 years old, The sea was not just a view, it was the only world that truly made sense to him. He was a young man built of muscle and quiet discipline, with a face bronzed by the Spanish sun and eyes that were always scanning the horizon for the next change in the weather. Juan lived in a small apartment that smelled of neoprene and sea salt. His gear was never just piled in a corner. It was maintained with a level of care that bordered on the religious. He would spend hours sitting on his floor, checking the valves on his twin steel tanks and running his fingers along the length of his rubber hoses to feel for any weakness. To Juan, diving was not a hobby or a sport. It was a technical pursuit that required a total surrender to the physics of the water. He understood that once you left the surface, you were entering a world that did not care if you lived or died. Cartagena in the early 1970s was a place of transitions. The city was modernizing, but the old traditions of the maritime families still held a powerful grip on the culture. Juan belonged to a generation of divers who were moving away from simple spearfishing and into the more dangerous, technical world of cave exploration. He was respected by the older fishermen for his nerve and by the younger divers for his knowledge of the local coast. He was a man who moved through the streets of the port with a steady, grounded energy, someone who seemed much older than his 23 years. His diving partner was a man he trusted with his life, a friend who had been through dozens of descents with him. They had a language of their own, a series of hand signals and nods that allowed them to communicate in the silence of the deep. On their days off, they would sit at the local cafes, drawing maps on paper napkins of the underwater topography they had explored. They were fascinated by the Cueva del Agua, a thermal cave system located inside a mountain near the coast. It was a place of mystery, known by the locals as the Water's Tomb, a name that carried a weight of warning. The cave was unique because the water inside it was naturally warm, heated by geothermal activity deep within the Earth's crust. While the Mediterranean outside could be cold and biting, the pools inside the mountain stayed at a constant 29 degrees Celsius. This warmth was seductive. It made the water feel like a bath, inviting the diver to relax and breathe more deeply. But Juan knew that this warmth was a trap. It hid the physical toll that the depth was taking on the body, making the heart beat faster and the lungs work harder without the diver even realizing they were being taxed. I should explain that at 29 degrees, the water is close enough to body temperature that it creates a strange psychological effect. It removes the boundary between the skin and the environment, making you feel as though you are floating in a void rather than a liquid. In a cave with zero light, this can lead to a total loss of spatial awareness. Furthermore, the heat speeds up the onset of nitrogen narcosis, a condition divers call the rapture of the deep, which feels like a heavy, warm drunkenness. It makes you feel invincible and calm, just as the situation is becoming lethal. Before the expedition, Juan spent the evening at his mother's house. She watched him eat with a quiet, lingering anxiety that she couldn't quite put into words. She knew that her son was an expert, but she also knew that the Cueva del Agua had a reputation for swallowing the things that entered it. Juan just smiled, his hands moving through the air to describe the beauty of the thermal pools. He told her about the way the light from his lamp would catch the mineral crystals on the walls. He was a man in love with the liquid darkness, unable to see the danger because he was so focused on the wonder. On the morning of the dive, the air near the mountain was still and heavy. Juan and his partner arrived at the small opening of the cave, carrying their heavy gear over the jagged limestone rocks. They moved with the synchronized grace of men who had done this 1,000 times. They suited up in the humid air, the smell of the damp rock mixing with the rubbery scent of their suits. Juan checked his pressure gauge one last time, the needle sitting steady on the mark. He looked at his partner, gave a sharp, confident nod, and then stepped into the dark, steaming pool of the inner mountain. The transition from the dry air to the thermal water was like stepping into a different reality. The warmth enveloped Juan, a physical pressure that seemed to push the salt and dust out of his pores. He felt the weight of the tanks on his back disappear as the water took his mass. He began to breathe through his regulator, the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the air, the only sound in the cavern. The water was clear at the surface, But as they began their descent into the narrow tunnels of the labyrinth, the darkness became absolute, broken only by the powerful beams of their handheld lamps. They moved deeper into the system, following a guide rope they had laid out on previous trips. The tunnels were narrow, the limestone walls slick and gray, twisting in directions that defied the logic of the surface. Juan felt the first tingle of the nitrogen narcosis, a varm, fuzzy sensation at the back of his skull that made his movements feel slow and effortless. He was aware of it, but he felt so calm, so perfectly at peace, that he simply let it wash over him. He was a part of the mountain now, a silent observer in a world that had been hidden for millions of years. The first distortion occurred about 40 minutes into the dive. As they moved through a narrow crevice, Juan's fin accidentally brushed against the floor of the cave. In a normal environment, this wouldn't have mattered, but in the Cueva del Agua, the bottom was covered in a thick layer of fine, organic silt. The moment it was touched, the silt didn't just drift, it exploded upward in a dark, opaque cloud. Within seconds, the crystal-clear water was transformed into a thick, brown liquid. Juan's lamp beam hit the cloud and reflected back at him, a blinding wall of light that showed nothing but mud. The pressure of the silence in that moment was overwhelming. The silt cloud was so dense that Juan could no longer see his own hands in front of his face. He reached out for the guide rope, his fingers grasping at the void, but he felt only the slick, cold stone of the cave wall. His partner was somewhere in the darkness beside him, but there was no way to communicate, no way to find each other in the liquid smoke. Juan's heart rate began to climb. The sound of his pulse, a heavy thumping in his ears that seemed to sync with the rhythmic hiss of his regulator. His breathing grew faster, more frantic, and the nitrogen narcosis intensified with every gulp of air. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, the warmth of the water no longer feeling like a bath, but like a suffocating blanket. He reached out again, his fingers scraping against a narrow opening in the rock. He thought to himself, "The line is gone. I have to find the surface." It was a flash of thought that carried the weight of a final realization. He was no longer a diver in control. He was a trapped animal trying to find a way out of a lightless, pressurized box. He began to move, his movements erratic and panicked. He pushed himself into a vertical fissure in the ceiling, a narrow chimney of rock that he hoped would lead to an air pocket. But the silt followed him, swirling in the water and blinding him even further. He felt the rock pressing against his tanks, a physical force that seemed to be squeezing the air out of his lungs. He was wedged into a space so narrow he could barely move his arms, the weight of the mountain above him feeling like a literal, crushing presence. He was breathing the last of his air in a world of brown mud. His partner managed to find the guide rope by luck and crawled his way back to the surface. Emerging from the pool, gasping and screaming Juan's name, the alarm was raised immediately, and the Civil Guard divers arrived within the hour. But as they looked into the dark, steaming water, they realized the magnitude of the problem. The silt had settled into a thick, opaque fog that would not clear. To enter the cave was to enter a maze where you couldn't see your own fins. The search for Juan Jose began in a state of near total blindness, a 15-day battle against the mountain. The Spanish Navy eventually sent their most elite divers to assist. They moved through the tunnels with a slow, agonizing caution, their hands feeling every inch of the rock face. They found the silt to be like a trap. Every time they moved, the visibility vanished again. The air in the cave was thick and humid, the temperature making the rescuers exhausted after only a few minutes. They searched the main galleries and the known tunnels, but there was no sign of Juan. It was as if the water's tomb had lived up to its name and simply dissolved him into the earth. You are floating in a vertical tube of stone, so narrow your shoulders are pinned against the cold, wet limestone. The water around you is the color of old coffee, thick with silt that sticks to your mask and clogs your senses. You are breathing through a regulator that is starting to hiss with the emptiness of the tank. The sound is sharp, mechanical vibration that you feel in your very teeth and jaw. You look up, but there is only darkness. and you realize that you have swum into a dead end, a chimney that leads nowhere but into the heart of the mountain. The discovery was made on the 15th day. A Navy diver, moving through a fissure that was thought to be too narrow for a human to enter, felt the smooth, unnatural texture of a diving tank. He reached up and found Juan Jose. The young man was wedged into a chimney, his body perfectly preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor water of the deep crevice. He was found just 3 meters below a pocket of air that he could have breathed if he had been able to see it. In the total darkness of the silt cloud, he had made a fatal choice to swim down instead of up. The recovery was a grim, technical challenge. The rescuers had to use specialized tools to cut the rock away and free the body, working in the same suffocating, zero-visibility conditions that had claimed Juan's life. When they finally brought him to the surface, the city of Cartagena was in a state of mourning. The young man who had lived for the sea had been taken by the mountain. His body, a testament to the fact that even the most experienced diver is a guest in a world that does not belong to them. The silver hallmarked spoon of his ambition had been filed away by the silt. I found a detail in the report that mentioned Juan's pressure gauge was found at 0. He had breathed every last liter of air in that narrow chimney, fighting until the very end to find the surface. The halocline, the shimmering line where the fresh thermal water met the salt water, had acted as a visual distortion that likely confused him in his final moments, making the floor of the cave look like the surface. It was a situational irony that the very beauty he sought in the water was what ultimately led him to his death. The mountain had used the light to hide the exit. The Cueva del Agua was sealed shortly after the recovery, its entrance blocked by heavy steel bars and concrete. The water's tomb was closed to the public, turning the mountain back into a silent, untouchable monument. The warm, dark pools inside still steam in the winter air, the geothermal heat continuing to vibrate through the limestone. But there are no more regulators hissing in the dark, no more lamps cutting through the silt. The cave has been returned to the absolute silence of the earth, a place where the memory of Juan Jose remains a quiet, heavy residue. The tragedy of the thermal abyss is a reminder that the environment does not need to be cold to be lethal. Sometimes the most dangerous traps are the ones that feel like a sanctuary, the ones that invite you to relax and let your guard down until it is too late to turn back. Juan Jose died in a bath of warm water, just a few feet from the air. A young man who followed his passion into a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. His story is a shadow that lingers on the coast of Spain, a warning to those who seek the light in the dark. On the other side of the globe, in the southern Alps of New Zealand, the water is not warm. It is frozen into a wall of ice that was about to do the impossible. In 1975, a group of men were sleeping in a shelter they believed was indestructible, only to realize that when the mountain decides to move, there is no such thing as safety. They were about to encounter a force of nature so powerful it didn't just bury the truth, it vaporized the very ground they were standing on. In 2020, the blue ice of the Polish glacier on Mount Aconcagua began to surrender a secret it had kept for nearly 50 years. A mountain porter was navigating a steep, rocky section near 19,000 feet when he spotted a glint of metal and weather-worn leather emerging from the melting silt. It was a Nicomat 35mm camera, still tucked inside its original case. Lashed to the strap was a small, handwritten tag from a camera shop in Denver, Colorado. The name on the tag belonged to a woman who had walked onto this mountain in 1973 and never walked off. Janet Johnson was a 36-year-old librarian from Denver who lived a life that was quiet, organized, and deeply focused. In her daily world, she moved between rows of neatly cataloged books, her fingers accustomed to the smooth texture of paper and the specific, dusty scent of a library at dusk. She was a woman of systems and logic, someone who found comfort in the fact that every question had a place where the answer was filed. She lived alone in a small apartment that reflected this same sense of order, with every object placed with a deliberate, quiet purpose. She was not a person who sought the spotlight, yet she possessed a physical toughness that surprised those who only saw the librarian in her wool cardigans. On the weekends, she traded the air-conditioned silence of the stacks for the thin, biting air of the Colorado Rockies. She was an elite climber, a member of the Mazamas Mountaineering Club, and she climbed with a steady, rhythmic intensity. For Janet, the mountains were not about conquest. They were about the clarity that comes when the world is stripped down to the next handhold and the sound of your own breathing. In the early mornings before work, Janet could be found at a local climbing gym or on the trailhead of a nearby peak. Her boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. She liked the repetition of it, the way her lungs would expand to meet the challenge of the incline. She kept a meticulously detailed journal of every ascent, noting the weather, her heart rate, and the specific gear she carried. This was her rhythm, a balance between the intellectual stillness of the library and the raw, physical exertion of the high peaks. She was a woman who prepared for everything. John Cooper was 35 years old, a NASA engineer who spent his days analyzing telemetry in the complex physics of spaceflight. He was a man who lived in the realm of high-precision data, where a decimal point in the wrong place could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. He had a sharp, analytical mind and a lean, athletic build that he pushed to the limit during his time away from the office. He looked at a mountain the way he looked at a launch sequence, a series of technical problems that could be solved with enough preparation and discipline. John's life was one of relentless optimization. He measured his caloric intake, tracked his sleep cycles, and spent his evenings studying topological maps of the world's highest ranges. He was not prone to emotional outbursts or flights of fancy. He was a creature of cold, hard facts. When he spoke, it was with a measured, engineering cadence, every word chosen for its maximum clarity. He moved through the world with a sense of mission, his eyes always fixed on the next elevation, the next milestone, the next data point to be conquered. The library where Janet worked was a world away from the launch pads John understood, yet they shared a fundamental need for structure. Janet spent hours cataloging new arrivals, the quiet thud of the date stamp acting as a metronome for her thoughts. She found a deep satisfaction in the physical weight of a hardcover book, the way the spine resisted just enough before opening. Her apartment was filled with these objects, arranged by genre and author, creating a fortress of information that she felt safe within. She was a woman who believed that truth was something you could find on a shelf. John's office at NASA was filled with the hum of early mainframe computers and the rustle of blueprint paper. He was used to the high-stakes environment of the space race, a world where the smallest vibration in a fuel line was a signal of impending disaster. He carried this vigilance into his mountaineering, checking and rechecking his knots until his fingers were raw. He was a man who didn't believe in luck. He believed in the redundancy of systems. If a system failed, it was because someone had overlooked a variable. He intended to never be that person. Both Janet and John were part of a team of 8 climbers from the Mazamas Club who traveled to Argentina in early 1973 to take on Aconcagua. They were experienced, well-equipped, and deeply respectful of the mountain. They spent weeks at base camp, acclimating to the altitude and watching the sky for the telltale signs of the viento blanco, the white wind that can turn the summit into a screaming, lethal vortex in a matter of minutes. They were a team of experts who believed that logic and preparation would always prevail over the elements. The expedition began to fracture as they reached the high-altitude camps. Some members were suffering from severe exhaustion, while others began to argue over the best route forward. The group dynamic, once solid and professional, was being eroded by the lack of oxygen. There is a specific kind of psychological pressure that occurs when you are standing on the roof of the world. You are physically depleted, your brain is starving, and every decision feels like a life or death struggle. The librarian and the engineer found themselves in a group that was slowly losing its way. A sharp observation about this environment is that high-altitude psychosis doesn't always look like madness. Sometimes it looks like a simple, stubborn refusal to accept reality, where a person becomes fixated on a single goal while ignoring the obvious signs of their own physical collapse. This is how a team of elite climbers can stand in the middle of a storm and convince themselves that they are perfectly fine, even as their bodies are shutting down. It is a medical irony that the higher you climb, the less you are able to trust the very mind that got you there in the first place. On the night of January 25th, the weather turned. The viento blanco arrived with a sound like a freight train, a deafening, high-pitched roar that vibrated in the very bones of the climbers. The temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, and the visibility vanished into a swirling wall of white powder. The team was scattered across the Polish glacier, huddled in tents that were being shredded by the wind. Janet and John were separated from the main group, along with two other climbers, and they were forced to make a desperate choice about whether to stay or descend. The decision was made to split the group further. Two climbers began a descent in the whiteout, while Janet and John remained high on the mountain. What happened next has been the subject of nearly 50 years of debate and whispered rumors. When the surviving members of the expedition finally reached safety, their stories were conflicting and clouded by the trauma of the storm. They spoke of mercy killings, of love triangles that had soured in the thin air, and of a moment where the thin veneer of civilization was stripped away by the sheer desperation of the Andean winter. John Cooper's body was found 2 years later by an Argentine search team. He was lying on a steep slope, his face frozen in an expression of profound, wide-eyed terror. But it was the nature of his injuries that disturbed the rescuers. He had a perfect, cylindrical hole in his abdomen, a wound so precise that no fall could explain it. Forensic experts who examined the photos decades later noted that the hole matched the diameter of a standard climbing ice screw. The suggestion was that someone had used a piece of mountaineering equipment as a weapon in the middle of the storm. Janet Johnson's body was not found until 1975. She was lying nearly 2,000 feet away from John, in a relatively flat area that should have been safe. Her face had been smashed by a heavy impact, and she was wearing clothing that was completely unsuitable for the summit. She was missing her heavy parka and one of her gloves. It looked as if she had been wandering in a state of total disorientation. Or perhaps she had been discarded by someone who was moving too fast to help her. The mystery of their deaths became a dark legend in the mountaineering community. The setting of the Polish glacier is a vertical wasteland of blue ice and gray scree, where the wind never stops and the air is so thin it feels like breathing through a wet cloth. You are standing on a slope so steep that one misstep means a 3,000-foot slide into the abyss. The sky is a deep, bruised purple, and the only sound is the rhythmic, mechanical rasp of your own breath and the high-pitched whistle of the wind through your gear. You look at your partner, but their goggles are frosted over, and you realize you have no idea who is actually standing behind the glass. The pressure in this narrow space is not just environmental. It is the weight of realizing that your brain is no longer functioning. You try to remember the name of your street in Denver, but the words are gone, replaced by a cold, white static. You feel the ice screw in your hand, its metal burning your skin through your glove, and a thought flickers through your mind with the weight of an anchor. If I don't stop him, neither of us will ever get home. This is the moment where the engineer and the librarian were replaced by something primal and desperate, high above the clouds. When the porter found the camera in 2020, the film inside was miraculously intact. The New York Times took the roll to a specialized lab where the frames were developed for the first time in half a century. The photos showed Janet and John in the days leading up to the storm. They looked haggard, their faces burned by the sun and etched with the strain of the altitude. But they were smiling. They looked like people who were still in control. The final photo on the roll was a blurry shot of the horizon, the sun setting over the Andes, a final witness to the beauty they had sought. The developed film also revealed a devastating truth. Some of the photos appeared to have been taken after the point where the survivors claimed Janet and John had died. It suggested that the pair had been alive and moving long after they had been abandoned by their teammates. The camera, which Janet had used to document her life with such precision in Denver, had become a silent, mechanical witness to a betrayal that took 50 years to come to light. The photos did not show the murder, but they showed the two of them standing together, lost but still fighting, as the storm closed in. The current update on this case is that while the Argentine authorities officially ruled the deaths as an accident due to exposure, the Mazimas Club conducted their own internal review following the discovery of the camera. The conflicting testimonies of the survivors, combined with the forensic evidence of the cylindrical wound and the timing of the photos, has led many to believe that a crime occurred on that glacier. However, because all of the primary witnesses have since passed away or are in their late 80s, the full truth will likely remain buried in the blue ice of the Polish route. Janet Johnson and John Cooper are no longer ghosts of the mountain. They have been returned to their families and buried in the earth they once called home. But the residue of their story remains at 20,000 feet. It is a story about the fragile nature of the human mind and the way that extreme environments can strip away the logic of a librarian and the precision of an engineer. Aconcagua is melting, and as the ice recedes, it continues to give back the objects that were lost agove. A boat, a camera, each one a small, heavy reminder that the mountain never forgets. People often say that what happens on the summit stays on the summit, as if the altitude creates a separate reality where the rules of the world no longer apply. But the truth is that the things we do in the dark eventually find their way into the light. Even if it takes 50 years for the ice to melt, sometimes a life is defined not by how we lived in the safety of our homes, but by the choices we made when the air ran out and the only thing left was the sound of the wind and the look in a friend's eyes. That was 1973. But some things that disappear in the mountains don't stay gone. Sometimes they just wait for the earth to warm up. In our final case, 2 young men left for the Matterhorn and vanished into a snowstorm that lasted half a century. When they finally surfaced, they hadn't aged a day, but the world they returned to was one they no longer recognized. In September 2014, a hiker was navigating the shifting silt and gray rubble at the foot of the Matterhorn Glacier in Switzerland. The sun was sharp, reflecting off the receding ice, which had been pulling back for decades. As he stepped over a cluster of jagged rocks, he saw something that didn't belong to the mountain. It was a single, vintage climbing boot made of thick, dark leather, its laces frayed but still tied in a firm double knot. It sat on the silt as if someone had just stepped out of it a moment ago. Yet the style was clearly from another era. The Matterhorn is a jagged, four-sided pyramid of rock that dominates the horizon of Zermatt, a peak that looks like it was carved by a violent Onsiahand. It is a mountain of legends and tragedies, a place where the air is thin and the weather can change with a speed that feels personal. But down at the base, where the glacier slowly grinds its way toward the valley, the mountain acts as a massive, slow-motion conveyor belt. It takes what falls from the heights, buries it in ice, and then, decades later, it finally gives it back to the world. Masayuki Kobayashi was 21 years old in 1970, a young man from the crowded, neon-lit streets of Tokyo who lived for the vertical silence of the peaks. In his daily life, he moved through the city with a quiet, observant energy, his mind often drifting to the topological maps he kept tucked in his bag. He was a student of discipline, someone who found beauty in the precise way a rope was coiled or the rhythmic scrape of a boot against stone. He was lean and focused, possessing a physical toughness that belied his soft-spoken nature. His best friend, Michio Oikawa, was 22, and the two of them were inseparable. They were part of a generation of Japanese climbers who were looking beyond their own islands, hungry for the legendary faces of the European Alps. Michio was the more outgoing of the two, with a laugh that could cut through the tension of a difficult ascent. But he shared Masayuki's absolute dedication to the craft. They spent their weekends in the Japanese Alps, pushing their bodies until their lungs burned and their fingers were numb, all in preparation for the Matterhorn. In Tokyo, their world was one of wool sweaters, heavy cotton trousers, and the mechanical click of vintage cameras. They didn't have GPS or high-tech synthetic fabrics. They relied on the quality of their leather and the strength of their own spirit. They would sit in small, smoky cafes, nursing cups of black coffee and debating the best route up the north face. To them, the Matterhorn was not just a mountain, it was a rite of passage, a place where they could prove that they belonged among the elite climbers of the world. Masayuki's mother watched him prepare with a silence that was heavy with unasked questions. She saw the way he meticulously checked his gear, the way he polished his leather boots until they shone, and the way he looked at the photographs of the Matterhorn. She didn't understand the lure of the heights, the need to stand in a place where the air was too thin to breathe easily. But she understood her son. She knew that for Masayuki, the climb was not a choice, but an inevitability. She packed his favorite snacks in his bag, a small bridge between his home and the ice. The journey from Tokyo to Zermatt was a long, shifting transition from the familiar to the unknown. As they arrived in the Swiss village, the Matterhorn loomed over them, a terrifying and beautiful presence that seemed to follow them through every street. They stayed in a small hostel, their room filled with the scent of pine and old stone. They spent their first few days acclimating, walking the lower trails and watching the peak through binoculars. The mountain felt like a living thing, a giant that was currently sleeping but could wake at any moment. Michio was fascinated by the history of the village, the way the local guides spoke of the mountain with a mixture of reverence and caution. He would sit on the balcony of their room, his mechanical watch ticking a steady, rhythmic cadence on his wrist. He found comfort in that sound, a small piece of human precision in a world of wild unpredictable stone. He and Masayuki were confident, their bodies at peak performance, their gear tested and ready. They felt they had prepared for every variable the mountain could throw at them. They left the Hornley hut in the early hours of August 18th, 1970. The air was crisp and silent, the sky a deep, velvety black filled with more stars than they had ever seen in Tokyo. They moved with a synchronized grace, their headlamps cutting small, bouncing paths through the dark. The north face of the Matterhorn is a wall of shadow and ice, a vertical labyrinth that requires total focus. For the first few hours, they were in their element, the rhythmic sound of their crampons biting into the frozen snow, the only noise in the void. A sharp observation about mountaineering in 1970 is that once you were on the face, you were truly alone. There were no radios, no emergency beacons, and no way to call for a helicopter if things went wrong. You were committed to the mountain in a way that is difficult for a modern person to grasp. Every step was a final decision, a commitment to the path you had chosen. Masayuki and Michio understood this weight. It was exactly what they had come for. The purity of a challenge where the only thing that mattered was their skill and their trust in each other. The pressure began to change as the sun rose, though it didn't bring the warmth they had hoped for. A thin, gray haze began to settle over the peak, and the wind started to pick up, carrying a sharp, biting chill that smelled of coming snow. They reached a high point on the north face, a place where the rock was slick with a thin layer of verglas. Masayuki looked at Michio, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of concern in his friend's eyes. The mountain was waking up, and the air was beginning to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that signaled a storm. They pushed on, their movements growing more urgent as the clouds thickened. The North Face is a place where there is no easy way off. Once you are high enough, the quickest way to safety is often to reach the summit and descend the easier Hornley Ridge. But the Matterhorn has its own logic. The storm moved in with a violent, sudden energy, turning the world into a swirling wall of white powder. The visibility vanished in seconds, and the sound of the wind grew into a deafening, physical force that seemed to be trying to peel them off the rock face. The sound of a mountain storm is not just a noise, it is a pressure that acts on your body. You feel the wind in your teeth, the vibration of the thunder in your spine, and the rhythmic thumping of the snow against your wool sweater. It is a sensory overload that makes it impossible to think clearly, turning the simple act of coiling a rope into a life-or-death struggle. Masayuki and Michio were caught in a vortex of white and gray, their world narrowing down to the few inches of stone directly in front of their faces. They were no longer climbing, they were surviving. Inside the whiteout, Time lost all meaning. They found a small ledge, a narrow shelf of rock that offered a fraction of protection from the wind. They huddled together, their bodies pressed against the cold stone, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Masayuki felt the cold creeping into his bones, a slow, heavy numbness that started in his toes and began to move upward. He thought of his mother in Tokyo, the way the kitchen smelled of tea and steamed rice, and he felt a sudden, sharp pang of regret. He realized that the mountain didn't care about his discipline or his maps. Michio checked his watch, the mechanical ticking now drowned out by the roar of the wind. He tried to say something to Masayuki, but his voice was swallowed instantly by the storm. He reached out and gripped his friend's shoulder. A final, desperate act of connection in a world that was falling apart. They were two young men at the height of their lives, caught in a geological event that was millions of years old. The choice to push for the summit or to stay on the ledge had been taken away from them. They were now part of the mountain's history. The search in 1970 was hindered by the very storm that took them. For days, the village of Zermatt watched the clouds, the guides waiting for a window that wouldn't come. When the weather finally cleared, a helicopter spotted a few items of gear near the top of the north face, a discarded pack, a tangled rope, but there was no sign of the men. They had vanished into the silence of the Matterhorn, leaving behind only the echo of their names and the grief of their families in Japan. They were declared lost, another two names on the long list of the mountain's victims. For 45 years, the glacier did its work. It took the bodies of Masayuki and Michio and buried them deep within its icy heart. It moved them slowly, inch by inch, down the mountain, preserving them in a tomb of perfect, everlasting cold. While the world in Tokyo changed, while the buildings grew taller and the neon grew brighter, the two young men stayed exactly as they were on that August night. They didn't age, they didn't change, and they didn't speak. They were caught in a frozen moment of 1970, waiting for the earth to warm. When the hiker found the boot in 2014, he didn't realize he was looking at the beginning of a 45-year-old homecoming. The Swiss authorities arrived, and as they carefully excavated the site, they found more than just gear. They found the remains of two men, still wearing their wool sweaters and their heavy trousers. The leather of their boots was still supple, and their equipment was a time capsule of a different era of climbing. They were found 1,000 meters below where their gear had first been spotted in 1970, a testament to the power of the glacial conveyor. The DNA testing was a slow, careful process that eventually connected the remains to two families in Tokyo. When the news reached Masayuki's brother, it was like a ghost had finally walked through the front door. The families had long ago accepted that the mountain was their son's final resting place. But the reality of their return was something else entirely. It was a bridge across nearly half a century, a chance to finally say the words that had been frozen in 1970. The young men were finally coming home, not as heroes of the heights, but as sons who had been lost. The forensic team noted a chilling detail during the recovery. Both of the men's mechanical watches had stopped at the exact same hour, their internal gears likely jammed by the same sudden, violent impact or the deep, penetrating cold of the storm. It was a final, synchronized act from two friends who had done everything together. The watches were small, frozen witnesses to the moment their time had run out. Two mechanical hearts that had stopped beating at the same second the mountain had claimed them. The silence of the watches was the silence of the Matterhorn itself. Masayuki and Michio were cremated in Switzerland, and their ashes were returned to Japan in 2015. They were buried in a quiet cemetery in Tokyo, the sound of the city's traffic a constant, modern hum over their graves. They are remembered as pioneers, two young men who had the courage to look beyond their own borders and seek the challenges of the world. But to their families, they are simply the boys who went to the mountain and stayed 21 forever. Their story is a quiet residue that lingers in the air of Zermatt, a reminder that the mountain always keeps a record. The Matterhorn North Face remains a place of intimidation and beauty, a vertical wasteland that continues to draw those who seek the silence of the peaks. But the glacier is shrinking, its ice thinning with every passing summer. It continues to give back what it has taken, a slow-motion revelation of the tragedies of the past. A boat, a camera, a rope, each one a small, heavy piece of a story that ended in the dark. The conveyor belt doesn't stop, and as the climate changes, the mountain will continue to discard its secrets into the light. Sometimes the most frightening thing about the wilderness is not that you might die there, but that you might be forgotten there, preserved in a silence that lasts for generations. But as Masayuki and Michio proved, even the deepest ice eventually melts, and even the longest silence eventually breaks. Their return was a reminder that we are all connected to the past by the smallest threads a tied lace, a ticking watch, or the memory of a mother's tea. The mountain may take a life, but it can never quite erase the name. The shadows of the 1970s are long, and they reach into our modern world in ways we often don't expect. They are the cold cases that refuse to stay buried, the disasters that are only now being understood, and the people who walked out of our lives only to return decades later as ghosts in the silt. As the rain continues to fall against your window tonight, remember that the world is much older and much deeper than it looks, and that some stories are just waiting for the right moment to finally tell themselves. Stay careful out there, check your locks, and remember that the silence is never quite as empty as it seems. Good night.